So we have different types of databases which we use to store or manage different data types. So the database you use to store a particular type of data, it can affect how much analysis you can do on the data, or you can impact the analysis you can do on the data. So as such, we have two main types of databases, a relational database and a non-relational database. A lot of the times, instead of a relational database, you hear of an SQL database. Now, SQL stands for Structured Query Language. And for a non-relational database, you hear people know SQL. It doesn't stand for no SQL. It stands for not only structured query language. For the relational database, it is used to store data that shows a relationship between variables. So things like your Excel document, that's an example of a relational database. So you can store different aspects that are showing relationship between various variables. And an aspect with relational database is that they are ACID compliant. A there stands for atomicity, which means it is an all or nothing process. So just using the example of the transaction I mentioned previously, if you go perform a transaction, your transaction either executes completely or it doesn't execute at all. So if you perform the transaction at location A, it either goes all the way or it shows you that the transaction was declined. So it is an all or nothing aspect of a relational database. The C stands for consistency. So it means once a transaction has been committed, the data must conform to that particular schema of the data. And the I is isolation. So with the isolation aspect of a relational database, one transaction does not affect the other. So the transactions are considered independent. So if you perform multiple transactions, they'll be executed as individual transactions, and one does not affect the other. And the D stands for durability. So if you perform a transaction and it goes through and an unexpected event happens, once the system recovers, your system has already recorded the transaction that was performed. So you do not lose a transaction. That's why if a transaction is performed in a bank account, for example, the person who performed the transaction cannot retrieve or retract the transaction because it's going to show in the system. So that's what the durability stands for. So that is the compliance aspect of the relational database. So just as I mentioned, an Excel sheet, that's an example of a relational database where you could have your name and you store different aspects corresponding to a particular individual. And with a relational database, you consist of columns and rows. Now, for the Amazon platform, you hear of Amazon RDAs, which is the Amazon version of the relational database. And it is an SQL managed service. And it makes it easy for you to operate to scale the relational database. So when they talk of scaling, they're talking of increasing or reducing your capacity based off the need of the process. And for a relational database, something to keep in mind, relational databases are OLTP. They are suited for OLTP transactions. So for online transactional processes, that's when you use OLTP, whereas OLEP, they're employed by non-relational databases. Other examples of relational databases on AWS, you have Oracle, you have MySQL, you have Postgres, SQL, you have MariaDB. So there are different relational databases on AWS. So this is a figure here that shows you the different types of relational databases on the Amazon platform. Okay. So the reason you want to use a relational database, one of them is it's easy to administer. So you do not need an infrastructure, and there's no need for you to install or manage the database software because Amazon already does that for you. And they're highly scalable, they're highly available and durable. And also, you see that they're quite inexpensive. So we've spoken about relational databases. We have other types of databases. Now, we have the NoSQL databases as well. We have a key value database, such as the DynamoDB. You have the document or Amazon Document DB. You have the in-memory database, such as the Elasticache. You have the graph, such as Neptune. We have the Elasticsearch. We have the time stream, and we have the quantum ledger database. So those are other types of databases, and those ones are non-relational databases.